All right, the recording should be started. Eric Brechner will be presenting today. He's a career coach and founder for Allies for Onlys in Tech. So you can introduce yourself and get started, Derek.
Well, thanks, Brant. All right. So, like Brant said, my name's Eric Brechner. I've been working in software development, software engineering from the time I was 16. So I'm not 16 anymore. It's been 40 years in the industry. As you can see here, I started out at an international bank in New York, working for them during the summers, and then also worked for Jet Propulsion Laboratory, GraphTech, which is a startup, Silicon Graphics, Boeing, and I spent the last 25 years at Microsoft before retiring recently to become a career coach for Ally for Onlys in Tech, which is my own little company. And I work with software professionals, mid-career software professionals, providing coaching, advice, helping with resumes and all that sort of thing. Also, uh, all kinds of skills around project management, software design, quality initiatives, running microservices, all that sort of thing. Just taking advantage of all the experience I've had and kind of working part-time now that I'm at a different point in my life. So I'm excited today to talk to you about doing peer presentations, which is something that folks in your group uh, need to do from time to time, just sharing information with each other. So let's talk a little bit about just effective presentations in general before we kind of get to doing peer presentations. And the three key things for any kind of effective presentation is first understanding the purpose of your presentation. So why are you doing it? You're going to a fair amount of trouble to do a presentation. So what's the point? What is the purpose of you doing it? Are you trying to convince people of something? You're trying to share some concepts? Uh, you're trying to just look good in front of your team, your manager. What is the purpose of it? The second thing that's absolutely critical to understand in advance is who your audience is, because that has a lot to do with how you structure your presentation, what information you include or don't include, how you go about talking about it, how you frame up your topics. Audience is absolutely critical. And then the last thing is if you want your presentation to be memorable, which hopefully you're going to all this trouble, hopefully it's a memorable presentation, is to structure it in terms of a story. People remember stories much better than just individual facts. So structuring it as a story is really important. All right, so how does that apply to effective presentations to your peers? Well, the purpose of presenting to your peers is just to share something you're passionate about with them, something that's really interesting to you, some ideas or concepts or technologies that you find particularly exciting or insightful. You want to share that information with them, and hopefully your passion for it, so that it's infectious and again that it's memorable. Uh, in terms of your audience, those are people with similar knowledge to you, similar experience to you. So that makes these presentations honestly a lot easier to do. People kind of freak out anytime they have to put together a presentation, and it seems like a lot of work and all that sort of thing. There's a lot on the line. In this particular case, for peer presentations, it's not so bad. These are people that you know. They have a lot in common with you, and so it's not as hard to kind of set it up and do it, and you don't have to go overboard. The mistake I see a lot in peer presentations is that there's this whole long warm up to describe what it is that you're talking about, which really isn't as necessary when you're talking to your peers. They're going to know a lot of things that you know. You certainly want to introduce new concepts, but you don't have to spend as much time talking about why computers are important or how they work. Most people will know that. And so the last thing then is just how you structure this story, particularly when it's a presentation of peers about some technology or something like that. I mean, what kind of story can you tell there? And the general story that most peer presentations follow is pretty simple. You start with the description of the problem. What is the problem that you're trying to solve? Then you bring up kind of an analogy to other problems to give people some insight into how you might solve that problem. And you talk about your solution. maybe come over some tips and tricks, to give people a little bit to remember some memorable little tidbits that are really helpful, and then talk about the outcome that you got from doing this solution. That's typically a pretty great way to structure your presentation. And by the way, along the way, as I'm giving this presentation right here, I have the chat window up, so if you have any questions, you can type them in there. I may not answer them right away, but we'll collect them all, and I'll be sure to answer them by the end. So there's your effective presentations for peers. Your purpose is to share that passion. Your audience are people a lot like you with a lot of the same knowledge, so you don't have to go into as much background information. And then this story of a problem, solution, and then an outcome with some analogies and tips and tricks along the way to make it more memorable and understandable. All right. So, what is the problem that we have? Yeah, I'll follow the same formula here for this presentation. What is the problem we have with doing peer presentations? Well, first problem that people talk about is that they don't have anything interesting to discuss, right? You're asked to do a presentation like, I don't know I don't know what I'm doing that's that interesting. I can't think of any topics. And then also, there's kind of the sense of you don't want to seem like a freak, right? Maybe you can think of some topics, but they seem kind of geeky or weird or some strange thing that you're interested in. You're not sure anyone else would be all that interested, honestly. And then, of course, you're busy, right? This is a peer presentation. You don't have to do it. And you've got a job, you've got a life, right? You don't have a lot of time to prep. So, that's a problem. And then last but not least, you're giving a presentation. I think it's listed as one of the scariest things that, when people list about things that are scary in their lives, having to make a presentation is one of those things that's really high on people's anxiety scale. So, just the whole, now you got to deal with this nervousness as well. So all these are real problems that you have to solve if you're going to actually do a peer presentation. So, what do we do about these things? Well, let me move my chat window here. So in terms of having, you know, nothing interesting to discuss, um, chances are you've got all kinds of interesting things to discuss. Just thinking about, do I have anything interesting to discuss? You probably already thought of 3 different things that you could do the presentation on, but you're not sure if other people are going to be interested about it. Well, get over it. It's just your peers. They'll probably be interested, especially if you find it interesting. The most compelling thing to people is something you find compelling because you'll be passionate about it. You'll talk about it, in an excited sort of way. It's just compelling to people when you find it compelling. So allow your interest to flow. Don't worry about seeming like a freak. You're surrounded by freaks. Remember, these are your peers. So, just feel free to just geek out, be interested, and you'll bring those other people along. They'll find it interesting again, like I said, if you find it interesting. In terms of time to prep, um, don't work so hard. Again, these are your peers. You don't have to impress them that much. You're just talking about something that's interesting to you. So just use the default blank template. I'm giving an example of that right now. Sure, a lot of people talk about, ooh, fancy presentations. You want a fancy background and pictures and all this beautiful stuff and make it look gorgeous and all this. Oh, please. Again, it's a peer presentation. Honestly, I use a blank template unless I absolutely positively have to use something else, which sometimes you do for formal presentations or presentations in big conferences or something like that. They have a template for you to use. But when I don't have to use a fancy template, a blank black and white one like today, it's fine. It works great. The text is readable. It's no big deal. So just, you don't have much time to prep? Don't spend much time. Put together a draft in 30 minutes. You know, just quickly jot down your ideas. Again, structure is what's the problem, right? Maybe an analogy that's optional. What's your solution, right? Maybe some tips and tricks along the way, and then how did it come out? You can throw that together in just a few minutes, especially for something that you're passionate about. Don't overdo it. Just throw it together. Now you've got your basics. Then you come back to it later if you like and fill out, and flesh it out a little bit if you want. Or if you don't have time, you're all good to go. You got your basic draft. It takes very little time to prep these peer presentations. So don't worry about it too much. The last thing is all about, how do you overcome your nervousness, right? And there, focus in on why you're doing it. Remember your purpose. You want to share this exciting, interesting thing, that you love, that you're passionate about. You want to share that with other people. That's your purpose. So anytime you feel like you're nervous, oh, why am I doing this? Oh, I have pit in my stomach. Oh God, I'm gonna be terrible. Then remember, oh yeah, but I'm talking about this cool thing. And other people should care about this cool thing. It's really cool. I really want to talk to them about peer presentations. They should know how to do a peer presentation. This is great. I'm going to tell them about peer. And then you take all that nervous energy and you convert it into your passion for giving the talk. Um, Another cool trick that works. I find that works much better than imagining people or some other silly thing, right? Just think about why you're doing it and take that energy there. The other thing that you can do and you should do before a presentation is you should go to the bathroom. It's a good idea anyway. You don't want to be uncomfortable while you present. But then stand in front of the mirror and do that Wonder Woman pose or that Superman pose, with your hands on your sides and stuff. And you spread your legs a little bit. You stand up straight, right? You're all big. You're making yourself big in front of the mirror. And that gives you a lot of confidence. I actually did that before this presentation, and it looks a little silly, but it really, psychologically, it just makes you more confident. Feels good. Just feels good to be big, and that can really cut down on your nervousness because it just gives you a lot of just an instant boost to confidence. Um, Apparently, there's some psychological reason for this or physiological reason for this, but it just works. So I highly recommend it. All right, so that's our problem and solutions to those basic problems. Uh, yeah, so let's talk now about the analogy, the solution tips and tricks. So let me give you an example to help kind of get you going on this. So um, let's use the example of test-driven development. So let's say you're doing a peer presentation on test-driven development. How would this like analogy, tips, and tricks go? Okay, so for test-driven development, um, I, I'm not going to do the full presentation here. I'm just going to give you a quick overview for a feel for this. So the problem here, again, using the same kind of formula here, the story, the problem is that people hate writing tests. That's the problem, and yet tests are essential. So you have to write your unit tests, you have all that, but people hate writing them, and tests are essential. So how do we get people? The problem is how do we get people to write these unit tests, these tests? And the analogy I'm going to use here is that, of course, people hate writing unit tests because it's kind of like an unpleasant thing to do. It's kind of like getting kids to eat vegetables. Most kids don't like eating vegetables. Obviously, there are always some kids who do enjoy vegetables. There are always exceptions, but by and large, people don't like to eat vegetables. And it's the same thing that people don't, by and large, like writing tests. There are always some people who love writing tests. God bless them. That's great. But for most people, they don't. Well, writing tests at the end, after you've written your code, that's like having vegetables for dessert. Does it get any worse? That's terrible. Ugh, why would you want to eat your vegetables last? No way. You want to eat your vegetables early and then get rewarded for it with dessert. So the solution for writing tests is instead of writing tests at the end, it's the most awful time to write them. All that's going to happen is they're going to fail and you're going to feel miserable. Not to mention it's unpleasant to write the test in the first place. The code probably wasn't written well to write tests with. It's just terrible. Gosh, you should definitely be writing your tests first, not last. And then the dessert is you get them to pass, which is great. You feel terrific. Now you've gotten these tests, which of course failed because you hadn't even written the code yet. So of course the tests fail. And then you write the code and now they pass. And it's this great thing. So of course you want to write your tests first. It's a marvelous way to go. Now, the problem with this, with writing these tests first, so that's the solution. You write the tests and then you write the code. And that's called test-driven development or test-first development. What a great way to encourage people to write tests. Unfortunately, there's a couple of tips and tricks here to kind of make it work out better. Okay, so one of them is you got to budget some extra time to write the test. Normally, people think of code complete or whatever. A lot of people talk about, feature complete. A lot of people have different names for this, but they think about that where you write the code and then later you write the tests and you budget for those separately. Obviously, if you're writing the test first, you got to budget a little extra time. People measure how long it takes to actually write the test, and 30% extra time is usually more than enough for you to write those tests. So you want to budget that up front. In fact, you actually save time working this way because it's a lot easier to write the tests early than it is to write them late. But budgeting that extra time makes everyone feel a little bit better about the extra effort that they have to put in. The second thing that you kind of want to do is focus when you're using test-driven development, focus on new code bases. See, the reason for this is that it's hard to add tests to existing code bases. It's really painful. Often they're not written in such a way that they're easy to write tests for. So especially when you're first starting out and getting the hang of test-driven development, it's better to do that for a new code base where starting from scratch, you're writing those tests, it's easy to write those tests, and then you write the code that makes those tests pass. So that's a great way to go. And then the last trick that I'll mention for test-driven development is using mocks. Often when you're writing the code, of course, you're calling into system calls, networking calls, database calls, stuff like that. Maybe even web services, whatever. And then obviously when you're writing these tests and you actually haven't written all that code and all that sort of thing, it's going to be hard to make them pass making those system calls. You don't want to do that anyway when it comes to writing unit tests, which is mostly what you use test-driven development for. So you're going to want to use mocks. And if you don't know what mocks are, you should learn about them. They're fantastic. So I highly recommend using mocks. So those are just a few tips and tricks. And what's the outcome of actually using test-driven development? Writing those tests first, you get higher quality code. That's way easier to refactor because anytime you make changes to the code, you can easily test it, and way easy to deploy because it's just going to work. Everything's pre-tested. You get much higher test coverage, and it's way more pleasant because, again, instead of eating your vegetables last, which is the worst thing to do, you're eating those vegetables first, and you're getting that great dessert of wonderful, high quality, well-designed code that's really testable, easy to refactor, and easy to deploy. What could be better? So that's an example of going through the analogy here. Obviously, the analogy was comparing testing to eating your vegetables, the solution of writing the test first, and then a few different tips and tricks before talking about the outcome. So that's the whole story there. It's pretty easy. I sounded excited about it and interested in it, and I am excited about this particular topic. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of what it's like to put together a very quick, simple, you can see it's just 5 slides here. Obviously, I would have formatted this as separate slides for each one of these. And then I could just leave it in black and white like I was talking about. Or, if you wanted to be cute with it, you could have a picture of vegetables, right? You could picture of some sad kid eating his vegetables, something like that to make it fun if you wanted to, but not that necessary. It's just a pure presentation. It doesn't need to be that fancy. All right. So I had another example there. If we want to do that a little later, I can go over it, having to do with doing visualizing digital airplanes. So we can come back to that if you like. So what's the outcome of doing peer presentations? Well, you make new friends and get new followers, which is fantastic. You just get people who are interested in what you're interested in. Maybe you got a bunch of new friends who love test-driven development. Who knows? Who didn't know that you were into it that much, or just liked hearing about it and now see you as an expert. What a great thing that is for building your network. You get new collaborators who might work on this project with you. Your interest with you. You get a new understanding of this topic. There is nothing like actually talking about a topic and having to explain it to someone else that actually teaches you more about that topic. You just straighten out all those little subtle things you'd never quite understood before about that. But when you have to describe it to someone else, you gain a great deal of new understanding yourself. And of course, you build up your own confidence just by putting yourself out there, describing these things, understanding it better, and having other people, really kind of, like what you're talking about. That just really built up your own confidence. So it's well worth doing these peer presentations. And I hope you take advantage of it and start doing it yourself and give it a try. It is super fun to do. I've been doing it for a lot of years now, and I really enjoy it. I've really come to appreciate how fun it is to tell other people about something that you find interesting and that you're passionate about. It's really a pleasure to do. And with that, I'll leave it open for any questions people have. Thanks very much for your time.
Um, so a question that I have is there a target duration that you like to shoot for with peer presentations?
I always like, especially for peer presentations, I always like leaving plenty of time for questions. So I have, say, 50 minutes, then I'll leave a good 20 minutes for questions, which means it's about a half-hour talk. Uh, if I've got, obviously some topics are more complicated and they require the extra time. Uh, but with peers, it's great for to leave just plenty of time for questions. So I figure I'll use maybe a half to two-thirds of the time for the presentation and the last third or even half for questions.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about also bringing some interesting things into my discussion and presentations. But now with the scenario of having this pandemic and doing everything in virtual, you think that still is applicable like before? Because you see that maybe there are something, for example, recorded, or what is your thoughts on that?
I, I'm sorry. So in terms of presenting longer or changing topics, what
Yeah,
were you
for
referring
example,
to?
yeah, I'm presenting, for example, then in the middle of my presentation, I bring some stories. But when I see that now I'm doing virtually and maybe there are something recorded, I'm more careful about that. So I said, oh, let's not going to just do the presentation. You know what I mean? I
Yeah,
don't know if it also affect yours but it happens for me a lot. So
yeah. I think, obviously these are very strange times that we're living in. Uh,
mm,
in some ways, it's wonderful because here I am. It's nighttime here. I'm in Seattle, and you guys are in a completely different time zone, and yet I can still do these talks with you so easily. So in
yeah,
that sense, it's nice. But you're right. A lot of these virtual presentations, of course, are recorded, and that may change the kind of content that you want to include or the
yeah,
personal level you want to get because it's like posted on the internet or something. Um, what I realized a long time ago as a software professional is that any email I write, any presentation I make, any conversation I have um, can easily uh, come back to haunt me later. You know,
mm,
and the reason for that is that you write an email, you think you're just writing to a few different people, but then it gets forwarded around, and before you know it, some cute comment that you made, maybe just in joking, all of a sudden comes back and becomes a thing.
mm,
I don't know about you, but that's happened to me, plenty of times where an email that I never meant to be seen by other people or interpreted a certain way, sure enough, becomes interpreted that way, is seen by those people. Um, it's just it's because it's electronic. Everything makes its way
yeah,
around.
yeah,
People talk to each other. There's all this social stuff, uh, uh, you know not just Facebook, but in Twitter, but even internal systems that do all kinds of uh, you know social networking and stuff like that within companies. So just in general, you always want to assume that anything you ever talk about can make it to just about anybody. And
mm,
by making that assumption up front, you just get used to thinking, okay, well, is what I'm saying inappropriate in any way? Uh, and okay, I want to be careful about that. Uh, could this information that I'm saying get to someone for whom it wasn't originally intended? Okay, how do I need to adjust my language so that maybe it's not perfect for them, but at least it's not deeply offensive or harmful. And that may seem a little confining, but what I've found is if you have the right intentions, if you're speaking, at a personal level from your own passion, and you're just respectful, that it's not so bad.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
And certainly in the case of our IEEE and Computer Society stuff, if you're giving a presentation, you don't want to be recorded, we don't have to record it.
Yep. But even then,
that doesn't
even
prevent
then, Brant,
someone from recording it, but
that's right. I've been recorded and found, I was just teaching or something like that, or giving an informal presentation. Someone just had their phone out and was recording me without really me realizing it, and it makes it out. And of course, people can just talk to each other and say, "Oh, did you hear what Eric or Brand said, or I'd said whatever." That stuff just gets out, and so always being a professional, always being respectful, and then only telling personal stories that you'd be okay if if they were shared. That doesn't restrict you that much,
Mm-hmm.
and you're always covered.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I have another example if you want to hear it.
Yeah, sure.
I made it just in case there weren't as many things to talk about. So here's another one just to give you another feel. This one talks about one of my favorite projects that I worked on when I was at Boeing, which was visualizing the Boeing. In this case, it was the Boeing 777, but a digital airliner. So and I did this as a peer presentation several times, as well as a public presentation, at SIGGRAPH and other places. So what's the problem? So an airliner, it turns out, one of these big ones like a 777 or a 767, a 737, these are very complicated machines. They have like 3 million parts, which when you work it out to kind of move your way through it and visualize it and actually kind of walk through one of these airplanes the way you would if you actually built it, is approximately 5 billion polygons a second in order to visualize it. And even on the fancy graphics that we have these days, they can handle millions and millions of triangles, hundreds of millions of triangles. 5 billion polygons a second is absurd. And so back when I was working at Boeing, which is more than 25 years ago, we didn't have anything close to this at that time. So how are you going to do this? Well, the way to think about the problem is the same way that we think these days about zoom on digital maps. So you bring up Google Maps or Bing Maps or any one of those maps type solutions. Obviously, there's way more detail there than can be shown on a screen, particularly a web browser at any given time. But the way that they solve that is that as you zoom in or zoom out, it shows you views that are appropriate, that are kind of these, not generalizations. It's level of detail, but it's not level of detail about an individual table or road. It's level of detail that actually changes as you go to different levels of zoom, where you see an entire city becomes just a dot, right? And then even that city disappears and the entire country may be just a dot or just a little, one little polygon. So this idea of simplifying entire areas rather than individual objects comes into play. And that's exactly the solution that I used for viewing the digital airplane. I had approximations for entire volumes instead of the typical thing that you do with these kinds of visualizations, where you simplify down parts to just a few polygons instead of the thousands some odd polygons that they might be made up of. You just do a few of them when they're far away. But here, that wouldn't have been good enough. because, with 3 million parts, you've still, even if you just use a single triangle for each part, which is absurd, of course, but even if you use that, you'd still have 3 million triangles. And at, 30 frames a second, or even just 10 frames a second, now you're talking about 30 million polygons a second or 90 million polygons a second. And again, back then, the fastest machines in the world were, just maybe 100,000 polygons a second. So it's still not going to work. So you really have to approximate volumes of space and collections of parts rather than individual parts. And you have to do that hierarchically so that there's a simplification for the entire plane, and then a simplification for the front end, back end, and then a simplification for each area, and then simplification until you finally, you get detailed finally down to the individual parts. So that's how we did it. He came up with some patents for it and everything. It was great. In terms of tips and tricks, one of them was that, okay, it looks a little weird to have these simplifications for entire areas of the plane, but it all makes sense to you if every time you pause, you start filling in that detail. So people, as long as the colors were okay and it was approximately the right shape, people would be fine with it as you were moving around. And then as soon as you stop to look at it more carefully, you just fill in that detail as you go. And it was very natural for people. So that worked out great. Another cute trick that we used was people, once they had this visualization for the aircraft that they could move through interactively, they just loved it. They realized that this would be super handy also for producing the manuals that get printed with the planes, and they used to actually print them. I think that was like an FCC requirement, or what is the name? Anyway, the government requirement to actually have these printed manuals. And in those printed manuals, they wouldn't have full color pictures because there's too much going on. You kind of want those outline drawings that you see in instructions for putting together your furniture and stuff. So what I did for that was I just, instead of drawing the polygons, I drew the outline and then the background color for the polygon. And that enabled them to create all the manuals directly out of this visualization, which saved actually almost more money, or maybe even more money. I don't know. I never really figured it out, but saved them, hundreds of millions of dollars, which is amazing. And then the last thing is that these people who are using this visualization, they're not gamers or something like that. These are aeronautical engineers, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers who are actually building the plane. So the UI for moving through the plane needed to be really, really simple. Basically just moving around a mouse and clicking it where you wanted to go. These people aren't used to, moving through 3D space. So keeping the UI as simple as possible really made a huge difference. It was not fancy at all, for doing that manipulation. And that made a big difference in terms of these engineers being able to adopt it quickly and using it to successfully make the airplane, which they did. The outcome of this saved $500 million on that first airplane. And that's money from back in the 90s. So it's a lot of money. And the first 777 that they ever built actually flew and probably is still flying for United Airlines. It's amazing. And there were $6 billion saved on the 777 program overall, at least at the time that I left the company, which is now like 25 years ago. So it was just a huge success to be able to draw the airplane with all those parts, but fast enough even on really old hardware. So it was just a lot of fun. So another example: problem, analogy, the solution, some tips and tricks, make it a little bit more memorable, give you some inside goodies, and then of course the outcome, which is great. So any other questions on doing these kinds of presentations? Well, if not, it's been my pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for taking time out of your evening to join me. And if you ever need any help in, I'll send this presentation to Brant. You can share it around. If you ever need any help with your own careers or giving presentations or writing up proposals, just finding new jobs, working on your resume, anything like that, anything having to do with being a software engineer, professional in our industry, I'm happy to help you out. I have very reasonable rates, and you can find out more about all of that kind of thing if you like at my website, which we have a link for right here, Ally for Onlys in Tech. So happy to help you out. It's a fun thing for me to do now these days, kind of part-time as I get to a new phase of my life. Well, thanks again.
All right,
It's great.
I'll stop the recording here, and then I've got some things to go over a little bit.